Hey guys, Mr. Tickzon here. I hope you're doing well. I hope life has been treating you good. Uh, out here we try to turn our hindsight into your foresight. And today we're going to be talking about debt. Now, debt is something that is very much frowned upon depending on where you are, and is celebrated in some way, shape, or form. Debt ultimately to people in the layman's term is just you owe me something, you owe me some peas, you owe me some money. Where's my cheddar? And in the grander scheme, it's just that you have an obligation to repay a certain amount of something or capital at a due amount of date, where there's irregular intervals, fixed period of time, and debt can also take different forms. So it's not necessarily a cash for cash. It could be assets to assets. It could be, if you have collateral and you put up collateral, you might have to pay off your debt with your car or with your house. So it's not strictly, oh, you gave me £100, I have to pay you £100. Now, typically the thing with it that most times is, even though it comes to the IOU, typically there's an interest that comes into it, and then depending on the type of debt, it can compound, and then it can have that either positive or negative effect. And then ultimately, debt, people, if you're biblical, it's like them, the borrower is the slave, is the slave to the person who lends. And to some extent that's true in terms of the way debt has been used over the years. Debt has been used to control companies, control countries. Even still today, it's been used to control people, and it might be having a very big influence in your life. And in the way it controls it as well is in that you have certain obligations to meet, and it might inform spending decisions that you have to make, or even obligations you might have to do. Now, ultimately, when it comes to debt, you hear the concept of good debt or bad debt. Good debt. You've heard of good debt or bad debt. Now, ultimately, what makes debt good, what makes debt bad, and also I'm going to talk about what makes debt cheap. Now, good debt and bad debt, the only real difference, the only real difference between good debt and bad debt, it depends on what you use it for. That is really the bottom line. Now, every debt typically, in terms of, we talk about just pure cash loans and that, there, and all these different names of credit card, mortgage, or all these different things, business loan, they're all loans just in a different product category. And in a sense, the category is all assessed based on risk. So if you actually go to any bank, to be fair, and most banks anyway, and you put in the scale of how much you want to borrow, typically when you go to the higher scale, the interest rate is low, because typically if somebody's going to borrow 30k, ideally the person is doing maybe a home renovation that's going to actually add value into the house. They're going to be investing into business. They're going to be doing something that is consolidating debt, so it actually provides that person, if somebody's going to be handling 30k of debt, you give them 4% of interest, as opposed to someone who needs 10k, which you give 7% interest, because it's presumed that the smaller amounts you need is probably for like frivolous spending. So there's a higher risk that you can't pay it back. So it's a weird way of looking at it. It's like, that's the reason why a house mortgage, your house might be 400k, but you get 4% interest. But if you go to payday loans, which you only need 1k, you could get 60% interest, because in terms of the risk of you not paying back, if you need £10, if you really need £10, you're more at risk of not paying back £10 than if you needed 25k. You're more likely to pay back 25k. It's a weird way to think about it, because you might think, oh, it's just £10, but it's like, if you need just £10, then you don't have any buffers. You probably don't have anything in between that. So that even goes on a sliding scale depending on the risk. So a credit card, for example, has a higher interest rate because it's a recurring payment. There's high risk on there, so that's why it has the compounding effect as well. Whereas with your mortgage, it can be fixed over time, because ultimately banks and lenders just want their money back. That's really what it is. They want to make sure that they can make as much money on the money that they have. And I'm not going into fractional reserve lending, all this thing, but they just want to make sure they make the most money they can make. So there's good debt and there's bad debt. Now, if you take out 25k and you put it as a deposit on a house, it can be quote unquote good debt. If you use it and then you go buy a car, it is, unless that car is a car for business, it's probably bad debt, because the car is depreciating. Okay, and because the car is depreciating, means it's losing value over time, which means if you bought it at 25k, by the time you come to sell it, it's worth 15k, but you still owe 25k. Now, if you get the 25k and you bought a house, then let's say if you're paying it over 5 years, and the house is now worth 50k more. If you refinance it, you take out the 50k, you've doubled the money that you invested, and you essentially put no money in there. Now, why I said it could be a good investment is because the interest rates matters. So if you get a loan for 25k and it's on 10%, and you go get a mortgage for 4%, well, you need to work out the difference. And so good debt comes down when the money that you have borrowed, you make more money than the money you've borrowed, essentially. On a higher, your return on investment in terms of interest, or your yield in terms of interest, is greater than what you did in terms of what's the word? In terms of borrowing. So if you took out let's say you took out a loan, this is not financial advice, and I wouldn't suggest you do this. Now, let's say, for example, you took out a loan for 25k, and you got it at 5% interest. Cool. Then you go and invest it in the stock market and got 10% interest. Now you have now made 5% on that money, and you can take it for free because it's all debt. Then you don't have to pay. Well, on the debt side, on the debt that you got out, you don't have to pay taxes, but you will have to pay taxes on the capital gains unless you did an ISA. But I digress. So good debt and bad debt comes down to how you use it ultimately. And debt is obviously can be a really good tool to use. Most companies are started with some level of debt, whether that comes in the form of business loans, angel investors, seed fund, or initial crowdfunding, of which you commit this money in order to scale up your business, and most of it is injected to use debt. Most people, even if they have money, for example, will use debt because it's a smarter way of you using your money to do things. Now, obviously, ultimately, debt can be a good thing, but it's a bad thing. But ultimately, it comes down to how you use it. Now, when they say money is cheap, and how you want to see if a loan is cheap, is that when you see that your loan is close enough to inflation, somewhere between inflation and the base rate of your central bank. So if your money, let's say inflation is 2%, if you have something that is like somewhere between 2-3%, something like that, that's a very cheap loan, essentially. Because ultimately, why it's also cheap as a loan is because over the next couple of years, your money will depreciate. The value of the loan will depreciate. So even though you're paying back £100 a month, because of the rate of inflation going, you're actually paying back £80 a month. So for example, if you got a loan at 2% a couple of years ago and it was like coming to the end, now this is your 5th year, now that inflation is 10%, you are technically paying less because the power of your money has actually gone down. So it's not actually an apples for apples comparison of how much you're actually paying back. So ultimately, paying back, debt can be good, it can be bad. Debt ultimately means you're financially committed to repaying something back, but ultimately money comes down to how you use it. So if you know what you're doing, cool. If you don't know what you're doing, cool. Ultimately, understanding how money works is very important because it's one of the reasons why people avoid credit cards as almost as a law, when it's not the smartest way to actually approach finances or money, particularly to your credit score. Now, there's ways of building your credit score without a credit card, but ultimately, it's to some extent, it's not necessarily, it is a game, but don't hate the player. It's more about understanding the game, that you know how to play use the rules in your favor for you to kind of get ahead. Because ultimately, when you come to buy a house or whatever you need to do, you will need debt. And if you don't understand how to use it, and if you don't know how to understand how to handle money in the small scale, you will never understand how to handle it in the big scale. It's really just that it. So the person that, if you are trying to get a loan or something like that, ultimately do affordability calculators. Never do a payday loan. They're just like sharks. Never do it. Just never do it. If your interest rate starts getting past 5%, 6%, then that's probably a bad thing for you to do. Just don't do it. Especially once anything passes 10%, you're in, unless it's a credit card, pay it off before the end of every month so you don't have to pay anything back. But any like loans, if you need the loan, there's smarter ways to do it. Most times you're not the last. You're not the last person to help them out. It's even more smarter, to be honest, is that if you need it, provided your credit score is good, you go take out 5k at 2% or 4%, or like 10. It's like typically after 7.5 that it kind of goes to the next band. But it's better for you to go take the 7.5. Again, this is only if you know what you're doing. Take the 6k, put it aside, use the 1.5, and then add the 1.5 when you've got it and pay it back. It'll give you a smaller repayment to pay over time as opposed to the payday loans. Never do payday loans. They're just, they prey on people who don't really understand what finances is. They tell you that this small money is okay because you just needed to solve a problem, whereas it's an opportunity for you to actually maybe invest and, you know, in your time and your knowledge to actually, you know what you're doing. If you see somebody that's about to go to a payday loan, just tell them no, don't do it. There's better ways to go about it for you to get out of the situation that you're in, because ultimately, that if you need a K in finances terms, these guys, you're high risk individuals, so they're hedging their risk of you not paying by basically giving you £10,000 or whatever. And then as just to add to the end, if you are in debt and you somehow came to the end of this, if you are in debt, you need to understand something like this. Financial institutions are made in a way that they have to show that they're not trying to put you in financial stress. So they have to try and their utmost to try and help you out. So if you can't pay back the £500 a month, don't just pray. Call them. They'll put you in a payment plan. They might freeze your credit card. They might freeze your loan. If you can't afford your mortgage, call the mortgage provider and tell them, listen, I'm struggling in hard times. I just lost my job. And they'll work with you. There's no way you call them and say it's just tough. They'll never say it's just tough, because if that's the case, then you go to Financial Conduct Authority and say that they're putting me in hard times, in financial distress over during the cost of living crisis. And it's making me choose between paying my bills and doing that. Obviously, stuff like electricity and stuff like that is a bit different, but I'm talking about pure debts, because obviously if you're on electricity or gas, go get on a contract as opposed to pay as you go, because it is cheaper, and they do a rolling contract, in that if you pay a certain amount over the month, so it averages out when it's cold and it's hot, so you don't actually end up paying so much, if that makes sense. So that is something that is a complex one. I'll speak about it a bit more, but the more you know, the more you know. It's not necessarily bad, it's not necessarily good. Ultimately, everybody should get what they can handle. There's kind of a theory out there about why million people who win the lottery always kind of go broke, is because not only about the velocity of money, but there's a theory that you only hold as much money as you feel as you can handle. So if you've now gone and won the lottery and you're not used to handling 1 million or something like that, you will start spending till you get back to where you were. So it's about understanding yourself and scaling it. Even though you can be approved for something, doesn't mean you should. You know, human beings, just because you can't do something doesn't mean you should. But debt is not something you should necessarily fear, particularly if you're about to do a business, particularly if you're going to be someone that's going to get into finances. If you're trying to actually scale up, you will need debt to some extent to scale up. Whether it's business, bringing in inventories, whatever it is, especially with an entrepreneur, you want to understand how that works in order for you to do what you need to do to kind of get where you want to get to. But yeah, my name's been Mr. Tickzon. Your name's been blessed. I hope you've had a lovely day, and I hope we've added some knowledge and some clarity to your life. So yeah, stay tuned. Tickzon Measures came here to help you guys out in everything that you can do, everything you need to know, turning hindsight into foresight, things that school and society failed to teach you. But we're here to help you out. So I hope you're having a lovely day, and take care, and hit the like.